The distant thunder of hooves was the first sound to break the silence. It stirred Dilea Edwards from a shallow, restless sleep, making her bolt upright in the small bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Dawn's first light was a pale gray thing, filtering through the threadbare curtains of her isolated cabin. Her hand, moving on its own, flew to her neck. She checked the high collar of her nightgown, making sure it was fastened securely. It was a habit she'd had for 3 years, 3 long years of hiding what the fire had left behind. This was Colorado Territory, 1873, 3 years since the blaze that consumed her family's ranch, her parents, and the face she used to have. 3 years of living alone on the edge of Timber Creek, where questions were few and visitors were fewer. She crept to the window, her bare feet silent on the rough-hewn floorboards. Through a small gap in the worn cotton, she saw him, a lone rider, a dark silhouette against the bleeding colors of the sunrise. He was getting closer. His horse, a powerful chestnut, slowed as it reached the edge of her property. Dilea didn't hesitate. She reached for her father's old shotgun, the cold weight of it familiar in her hands. Visitors out here never meant good news. They meant trouble, or they meant they were in trouble. Either way, it was something she didn't want. Her fingers brushed against the scarred, mottled skin of her wrist where the sleeve of her nightgown had slipped. She yanked it down with a hiss. No one could see. No one ever saw. "Hello, the house." The man's voice was deep, carrying easily across the quiet yard. "Might I trouble you for some water? My horse is about done in." She stood frozen behind the door, the shotgun held low. The nearest town was a hard 30-mile ride east. The mountains to the west were a death trap for the unprepared. To deny a man water out here, it was a death sentence, and that was a sin she wasn't ready to carry. "Water pump is round back," she called out, her voice raspy from disuse. "Help yourself, then be on your way." She dressed in a hurry, the coarse fabric of her daily dress scraping against the tender, ruined skin of her shoulders and back. She winced, but the pain was an old friend. In the small, cracked mirror on her dresser, she saw only her face, still young at 22, still framed by the same auburn hair that had once been her pride. She never let her gaze drift lower. She refused to see what the flames had taken. When she stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, the stranger was leading his horse from the trough. He was tall, lean but strong, with a face weathered by the sun. He couldn't be much older than 30. He tipped his hat, and his eyes, a startling, piercing blue, met hers. There was a directness in his gaze that made her want to retreat back into the shadows of her cabin. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said. His voice had the slight, lazy drawl of a Texan. "Name's Caleb Daniels, heading to Silvercliff. Heard they need men for the new mine." Dilea just nodded, her knuckles white on the shotgun. "You're off course. Silvercliff is northeast." A smile touched the corners of his eyes, crinkling the sun-baked skin. "Wouldn't be the first time I've been lost. Was tracking some fellas. They helped themselves to my supplies a couple nights back." Her grip on the rifle tightened. "Bandits?" she asked. His smile vanished. His face went hard as granite. "3 of them. They didn't just take my gear. They shot my partner." Something in his voice, a cold, sharp edge of grief, made her pause. Against her better judgment, she heard herself speak. "I can spare some coffee. Before you go." He looked surprised, but he nodded. "That's mighty kind." Inside, she moved with practiced efficiency, keeping her back to the wall, always aware of where he was. He sat by the door, exactly where she'd told him to. He didn't pry. He just watched. "You live out here all alone?" he asked, his voice quiet, respectful. "I do," she said, her tone a clear warning. "Brave woman," he said, ignoring it. "This land ain't known for its kindness." Neither am I, she replied, placing a steaming mug of coffee on the small table in front of him. He took a sip. This is good. Real good. He looked at her over the rim of the cup, his blue eyes seeming to see more than she wanted. The men who robbed me, she said, changing the subject. What did they look like? He put the cup down, his gaze sharpening. Two young ones, barely old enough to grow a beard, and an older man. Got a nasty scar clean through his left eyebrow. He paused, and his voice dropped. You've seen them? It wasn't a question. She moved to the window, her body tense. They came by yesterday, looking to buy supplies. She turned to face him, the memory making her skin crawl. I didn't like the way they looked at this place, or at me. Caleb's expression turned grim. Men like that, they find a woman alone. They'll be back. I've handled worse, Dilea said, her hand instinctively going to her collar. He saw the gesture. He saw it, but he said nothing about it. Instead, he stood up. Miss Edwards, he said, his voice low and serious. Those men killed my friend for a handful of beans and some bullets. I can't just ride off, knowing they've set their sights on you. Before she could tell him to go, before she could tell him she didn't need his help, she heard it. The sound that had woken her up. The distant thunder of hooves. And this time it wasn't a lone rider. Caleb was at the window in an instant, peering through the curtains. His body went rigid. 3 riders, he said, his voice a low growl. Looks like they came back for more than just supplies. Delea's blood ran cold, but years of solitude had forged a core of steel within her. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. There's a cellar door, under the rug. My father built a hideout for when the Comanche were raiding. No, Caleb said, shaking his head. He turned from the window and his eyes were like blue ice. You go down there. I'll handle this. This is my home, she snapped, already moving to grab the extra box of shells from a drawer. I'm not hiding while a stranger defends it. Their eyes locked. A silent, sudden understanding passed between them. A recognition of 2 people who had been forged in hardship. All right, he conceded. But stay away from the windows. These men, they shoot first and ask questions never. They moved fast, barring the door, checking the shutters. Caleb took the front window. Delea took the rear. The riders didn't bother with stealth. They trotted right into the yard and dismounted. A harsh voice yelled out, Hello, the house! We're coming in for that coffee you promised, little lady. It was Johnston, the leader, the one with the scar. Dalea's heart hammered. I believe the lady's hospitality has run out, Caleb called back, his tone dangerously calm. There was a moment of silence, then a burst of cruel laughter. Well, now, looks like she found herself some company, Johnston shouted. Send him out, lady. We just want to talk. I think not, Caleb replied. The first gunshot shattered the window next to Caleb's head. Glass exploded across the floor. He dropped and rolled, firing back with a fluid, practiced motion that spoke of a life far more violent than that of a simple miner. Outside, a man screamed. You hit! Delea yelled. Not a scratch! His words were cut off by a deafening crash as the back door splintered inward, ripped from its hinges. A burly figure lunged through the opening. Delea didn't think. She fired. The shotgun blast caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a howl of rage and pain. But there was another one right behind him. He slammed into her before she could reload, driving her backward. The rifle flew from her hands. They crashed to the floor, and his rough, dirty hands closed around her throat. Her world narrowed to a tunnel of roaring sound and fading light. He was heavy, smelling of sweat and whiskey, snarling curses in her face. Fighting the blackness, she clawed at his face, her nails digging into his eye. He roared, and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She drove her knee upward with every ounce of strength she had. He doubled over with a grunt, and she scrambled away, gasping for air, her hand finding the fallen shotgun. She swung it like a club, the heavy wooden stock connecting with his temple with a sickening crack. He collapsed like a sack of grain. She staggered to her feet, her throat on fire, just as Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, his pistol aimed at the unconscious man. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. She could only nod, her hand trembling as she touched her bruised neck. "The others?" "One's dead. Johnston's hit, but he got to his horse and rode off." He knelt by the man she'd struck. "This one's out cold." In the ringing silence that followed, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a shaking weakness in its place. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, the rough fabric pulled away to expose the twisted keloid edge of a burn scar that snaked over her collarbone. She quickly pulled the torn cloth together, but it was too late. Caleb had seen it. His expression changed. The hardness in his eyes softened for a moment into something else. Something that looked dangerously like understanding. He didn't say a word about it. He just turned and found a rope to tie up their prisoner. "Johnston will be back," he said, his voice grim as he tightened the knots. "And he won't come alone." Delia sank into a chair, her whole body trembling. "There's always someone," she said, her voice bitter. "If it's not him, it's another one." Caleb finished his work and leaned against the door frame, watching her. "Doesn't look to me like you need anyone's pity, Miss Edwards." But as he spoke, he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the unconscious man on the floor. And he wasn't just looking. He was searching him. His hands moved quickly, patting down the man's pockets, his boots. "What are you doing?" Delia asked. He didn't answer. His fingers found something tucked into the bandit's belt. It wasn't a knife. It was a folded piece of paper. Caleb opened it. His face went pale beneath the tan. "What is it?" she demanded, standing up. He looked at her, and the stranger she thought she was beginning to understand vanished. In his place was someone else entirely, someone colder, more dangerous. "This wasn't a random robbery," he said, his voice flat. "They weren't here for supplies." He held out the paper. It was a crude, hand-drawn map, a map of her property. Her cabin was circled in charcoal, but there was something else marked with a rough X, right over the spot where the old barn used to stand. The barn that had burned to the ground 3 years ago. Next to the X was a single, chilling word. Ledger. "What does that mean?" she whispered, a cold dread seeping into her bones. "What ledger?" Caleb stared at her, and his next words shattered the fragile piece of her world forever. "The fire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The one that destroyed your family's ranch. Tell me, Delia, was it on the night of the train derailment at Devil's Gulch?" She couldn't breathe. Her mind reeled, flashing back to that horrible night. The smell of smoke, the screams, the heat, and before it all, the sound that had echoed through the valley. A distant, booming crash. The sound of a train leaving its tracks. It was the exact same night. And in that horrifying moment of realization, Delia Edwards knew. The fire that had destroyed her life, the fire that had scarred her body and soul, had not been an accident. It had been an execution. Caleb saw the answer in her eyes. He grabbed the bound bandit by the collar, hauling him halfway to his feet. "Who sent you?" he snarled, his voice a low, vicious thing. "Who are you working for?" The man just laughed, blood bubbling on his lips. "You're too late, Daniels. Or whatever your real name is. He already knows she's alive." The name, Daniels, sounded wrong on the man's tongue. A lie. Everything was a lie. "Who knows I'm alive?" Delia demanded, her voice shaking. The bandit's eyes flickered towards her, filled with a cruel amusement. "The man who paid to have you put in the ground 3 years ago." Caleb's fist connected with the man's jaw, a sharp, cracking sound that echoed in the small cabin. The bandit slumped back into unconsciousness. "My name isn't Caleb Daniels," the stranger said, not looking at her. His back was to her as he stared down at the man on the floor. "I'm not a miner, and my partner wasn't just my partner." He finally turned to face her. The friendly Texan was gone. In his place was a man with the eyes of a hunter, haunted and deadly. "I'm a Pinkerton agent. My real name is Cole, and the man they shot was my brother. We were hunting a man named Silas Blackwood, a railroad baron who staged that train derailment at Devil's Gulch to steal a federal payroll and fake his own death." He held up the crude map again. "My brother had evidence, a ledger detailing all of Blackwood's crimes. He was supposed to meet me, but he never showed up. All we knew was that he was last seen near Timber Creek, trying to get the ledger to someone he trusted." Delaya's world was spinning. "My father, he did business with the railroad. He said they were crooks." Cole's eyes, a piercing, painful blue, locked onto hers. "Did he now? It seems your father stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. Blackwood must have found out. He must have sent his men to get the ledger and silence your family for good." Her life, the lonely, painful existence she had carved out for herself, was built on a lie. She wasn't the survivor of a tragic accident. She was the sole survivor of a massacre. The wounded bandit on the floor began to stir, groaning. Cole was on him in an instant, a knife blade pressed against the man's throat. "One last chance. Where is Blackwood? Who else is in his crew?" The man's eyes were wide with terror. He coughed, spitting blood. "Don't know. Blackwood's a ghost. But Weston knows. He knows everything." Delaya froze. The name hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Weston. It couldn't be. "Weston?" Cole pressed, the knife digging deeper. "Who is Weston?" But the bandit's eyes were already glazing over. His body went limp. He was gone. Cole stood up, wiping the blade on his pants. He looked at Delaya's face, at the pure horror etched there. "You know that name." She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her mind screaming. Weston was the name of the man she was supposed to marry, the man who had held her, who had promised her a future, a life, the man who had visited her once after the fire, his face a mask of pity and revulsion, the man who had left her because he said he wasn't strong enough to look at her scars every day. Cole must have seen something in her expression. He knelt beside the dead bandit again, his hands moving with a grim purpose. He wasn't just searching for weapons now. He was searching for anything. He pulled off the man's boots, turning them upside down. Something small fell out and landed on the wooden floor. It was a photograph, small, creased, and singed at the edges. Cole picked it up. He stared at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he held it out to her. Delaya's hand trembled as she took it. It was a picture of her from before, from the life that had been stolen. She was smiling, her face untouched by fire, her eyes bright with hope. And standing next to her, with his arm wrapped proudly around her waist, was her fiancé, James Weston. He wasn't just the man who had abandoned her. He was the man who had tried to have her murdered. The photograph fell from her numb fingers. The happy, smiling faces staring up from the floor were a grotesque mockery. Her love, her future, her entire past. It was all a lie, crafted by the man who had plotted to burn her alive. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot agony that eclipsed even the memory of the flames. He hadn't left her because of her scars. He had left her because he thought she was supposed to be dead. Cole watched her, his expression grim. "I know him," he said, his voice quiet. "Weston was Blackwood's right-hand man, a ruthless enforcer. We thought he died in the derailment with everyone else." "He told me he was leaving the territory," Delaya whispered, the words tasting like ash. "He said he was going back east to start over." Another lie. It was all lies. He stayed, Cole said. He stayed to make sure the job was finished, to make sure the only witness, and the ledger, were gone for good. Suddenly, the isolation she had clung to for 3 years felt like a cage. She had been hiding from the world's pity, while the man who destroyed her had been walking free, believing his crimes were buried and forgotten. He had been so close. The ledger, she said, her voice finding a new, hard edge. My father. If he had it, he would have hidden it. He wouldn't have kept it in the house. She racked her brain, trying to push through the fog of grief. He had a chest, an old tool chest he was so proud of. He always said it held his most valuable things. They found it in the small, dilapidated shed out back. It was heavy, made of oak and bound with iron. It was locked. Cole made short work of the lock with the butt of his pistol. Inside, it was filled with old, rusted tools. Disappointment washed over Delia. It was just a toolbox. Wait, Cole said. He ran his hands along the inside, knocking on the wood. Near the bottom, a section sounded different. Hollow. He pried at it with his knife, and a false bottom popped loose. Beneath it, there was no ledger. Instead, there was a single, sealed envelope, addressed to her in her father's familiar script. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was short, written in a frantic, hurried hand. My dearest Delia, if you are reading this, I have failed. The men I trusted at the railroad, Blackwood and his associate Weston, are not what they seem. They are thieves and murderers. I have proof of their crimes, an account of their sins that could see them hang. I cannot keep it here. It is too dangerous. I have entrusted it to the only man I know with the integrity to protect it. Find him. He is the Rock of Silver Cliff. He will know what to do. Forgive me for bringing this darkness to our door. Know that your mother and I love you more than life itself. The Rock of Silver Cliff. It was a riddle. We have to go, Cole said, his voice urgent. They know you're alive, and they know the ledger is still out there. Johnston got away. He's already on his way to tell Weston that we have a survivor. They will send everyone. They had a destination, a chance, but as they gathered what little they could, ammunition, water, the last of the dried jerky, Delia happened to glance out the window toward the high ridges that surrounded her small valley. Her heart stopped. On the crest of the nearest hill, a plume of smoke was rising into the dawn sky. A signal. Then to the west, another smoke signal answered it, and then another to the north. They were painting a circle in the sky, a circle with her cabin at its center. Johnston hadn't just ridden for help. He had brought an army, and they were already here. They're boxing us in, Cole said, his voice a low growl as he peered out the window. We're not getting out of here on horseback. The first rifle shot cracked through the morning air, splintering the wood of the window frame next to his head. It wasn't a warning. It was the start of the siege. Bullets began to rain down on the small cabin, tearing through the thin walls like angry hornets. Wood exploded inwards. Glass shattered. Delia and Cole hit the floor, crawling behind the meager cover of an overturned table. How many? She yelled over the deafening roar. Too many, he yelled back, returning fire through a gap in the wall. A dozen, maybe more, Blackwood's whole crew. This wasn't a fight for a ledger anymore. This was a fight for their lives. The cabin was a death trap, and the walls were closing in. They exchanged fire, a desperate, hopeless battle against impossible odds. A bullet tore through the wall and ricocheted, catching Cole across the ribs. He grunted in pain, his shirt ripping open to reveal a landscape of jagged, puckered scar tissue across his torso, old and white against his skin. You're hurt, she cried. It's an old friend, he grunted, never taking his eyes off the enemy. Another volley of shots ripped through the kitchen. A large splinter of wood, sharp as a spear, flew across the room and tore through the sleeve of Dilea's dress, gashing her arm. The fabric ripped away, exposing the full, horrific extent of the burn scars that covered her entire left arm from shoulder to wrist. Cole saw it. In the midst of the chaos and gunfire, his eyes met hers. And in that moment, there was no pity. There was only a shared, brutal understanding. They were both survivors, marked by the fires of their past. "We're not dying here," he said, his voice a raw promise. He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on the small stock of lamp oil she kept by the hearth. A desperate, crazy idea was forming on his face. "You said you had a cellar." "Yes, but they'll just burn us out." "They won't if the fire is somewhere else," he said, a wild glint in his eye. "The shed. It's full of dry tinder and my saddlebags, with the last of my dynamite." It was suicide, but it was their only chance. Under a hail of gunfire, they scrambled to the cellar door. Cole handed her a lit oil lamp. "When I give the signal, you throw this into the shed. The explosion should give us enough cover to make a break for the trees behind the cabin." "Got it?" She nodded, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He took a deep breath. "Now!" He kicked open the cellar door and laid down a covering fire toward the front of the house, drawing their attention. Delea scrambled to the shattered back doorway, shielded by the smoke and chaos. She hurled the lamp with all her might. It sailed through the air, a perfect arc of flame, and disappeared into the dark opening of the shed. For a second, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. A deafening roar shook the very ground beneath them. The shed vanished in a ball of fire and splintered wood, sending a shockwave rippling across the yard. The gunmen, caught completely by surprise, were thrown to the ground or momentarily blinded. "Go!" Cole screamed, grabbing her hand. They bolted from the back of the disintegrating cabin, running for the tree line, for the safety of the deep woods. Debris rained down around them. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. They were almost there, just a few more yards. Then Delea heard Johnston's voice, screaming in rage from behind them. "There they are!" A single shot rang out, clearer and closer than the others. Cole cried out, a sharp gasp of pain. He shoved her forward, his body taking the force of the impact. He stumbled, but didn't fall, his momentum carrying them the last few feet into the cover of the dense forest. He collapsed against a thick pine, his hand pressed to his side, blood already seeping through his fingers. "Cole!" she cried, grabbing him as he started to slide to the ground. "I'm all right," he gasped, but the lie was plain on his face, pale and slick with sweat. "Just keep running." They could hear Johnston and his men crashing through the underbrush behind them, closing in. Cole was a dead weight, his breath coming in ragged, shallow pants. They couldn't outrun them. Not like this. Delea's mind raced. Her father had taught her these woods. Every creek, every game trail, every rock formation. He'd taught her how to survive. "This way," she said, pulling his arm over her shoulder, taking on his weight. "I know a place." She led him through the forest, her knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. She found the hidden ravine, the narrow cut in the rock that led to a small, dark cave, its entrance hidden behind a thick curtain of ancient ivy. She half dragged, half carried him inside, collapsing with him onto the damp, cold earth as the sounds of their pursuers faded in the distance. He was losing a lot of blood. The bullet was still inside him. She tore a strip from her petticoat, pressing it hard against the wound. His skin was cold and clammy. "Delea," he whispered, his eyes clouded with pain. He reached up, his fingers brushing the scars on her arm, the ones she had just revealed in the heat of battle. "You're a survivor," she finished for him, her voice harder than she'd ever heard it. "Just like you. And you are not going to die. I won't let you." Using the skills her father had taught her, she cleaned the wound with whiskey from Cole's flask. With the point of his knife, sterilized in the flame of a match, she probed for the bullet. It was a brutal, agonizing process. He passed out from the pain, his head lolling to the side. As she worked, digging the lead from his flesh, he began to mutter, lost in a fever dream. He spoke of his brother, not as a partner, but as family. He spoke of the guilt he carried for not being there, for not saving him. He spoke of Silas Blackwood, not as a target, but as a monster who had stolen the only family he had left. This wasn't a job for him. It had never been a job. It was revenge. By the time she had the bullet out and the wound stitched and bandaged, she understood the fire that drove him. It was the same fire that was now beginning to burn inside her. He was unconscious for 2 days. Delia kept watch, tending to his fever, giving him sips of water from a nearby spring. She was no longer just a victim. She was a protector, a fighter. The woman who hid from the world was gone, burned away in the firefight that had destroyed her home. When Cole finally woke, his eyes were clear. He looked at her, at the cave, at his bandaged side. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse. "We save each other," she replied. The dynamic between them had changed. The lies were gone. All that was left was a raw, shared purpose. He told her everything about his real past as a federal marshal before he went after Blackwood off the books, about how his brother had infiltrated Blackwood's gang, about how Weston had been the one to discover his brother's betrayal and had personally overseen his torture and execution. Her fiancé wasn't just a murderer. He was a monster. "The Rock of Silver Cliff," he said, his focus returning. "It must be a person. Someone your father trusted. We still have to get there." It took them a week to travel the 30 miles to Silver Cliff, moving by night, hiding by day. They were hunted, and they knew it. They survived on what little game Delia could trap. They moved like ghosts through the wilderness, their shared danger forging a bond between them that was stronger than steel. They learned to fight as a team, to anticipate each other's moves, to communicate with a single glance. In the quiet moments, huddled by a smokeless fire in the dead of night, something else grew between them, a fragile, unspoken tenderness, a recognition of the broken pieces in each other that somehow fit together. When they finally saw the lights of Silver Cliff, it was a sprawling, chaotic mining town carved into the side of a mountain. It was bigger and rougher than they had imagined, and as they walked cautiously into the muddy main street, hiding in the shadows of the evening crowds, they saw it. On the wall of the largest building, the headquarters of the Silver Cliff Mining Company, was a massive painted sign, and on that sign was a portrait, a handsome, smiling man depicted as a hero of the people. It was a portrait of James Weston. Underneath his name, a title was printed in bold letters, Chief of Security. They hadn't just come to Silver Cliff to find a ledger. They had walked straight into the kingdom that James Weston had built on the ashes of their lives. They were in the lion's den, and the lion was the king of the town. Weston's face was everywhere, on posters praising his swift justice, on the lips of the miners who saw him as their protector. He controlled the company guards who acted as the town's only law. He was untouchable. "The Rock," Cole whispered as they found a room in a derelict boarding house on the edge of town. "It's not just a person. It has to be someone Weston can't touch. Someone old, established, someone who was here before the mine." Delia thought back to her father's visits to Silver Cliff. He always met with one man, an old, grizzled prospector named Jebediah, a man who had been panning for gold in these hills since before Colorado was even a territory. He lived in a tiny shack up the canyon, away from the town proper. Her father had called him stubborn as a mountain, the Rock of Silver Cliff. They found him the next morning. Jebediah was ancient, with a beard like a snowdrift and eyes that had seen it all. When Delia told him who she was, the old man's face cracked into a sad smile. "Your father was a good man," he said, his voice like gravel. "He knew trouble was coming. He gave me something to hold for you, said you'd know what it was for when the time was right." He led them to a loose stone in his hearth. From the dark space behind it, he pulled a heavy leather-bound book. The ledger. It was all there. Names, dates, payroll figures, shipments of weapons, all tied to Blackwood and, more importantly, to Weston. It was enough to hang them all 10 times over. They had the proof, but they were trapped in a town run by the very man they needed to expose. "We can't just ride out of here," Cole said, staring at the ledger. "Weston's men watch every road. We'd be dead before we cleared the canyon." A cold, calculated fury was building in Delia. She had spent 3 years hiding. She was done hiding. "No," she said, her voice steady. "We're not going to run. I'm going to face him." Cole stared at her. "Delia, no, it's too dangerous." "He knows me, Cole," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "He knows the woman I was, weak, scared. He won't be expecting the woman I am now." Her plan was terrifyingly simple. She would be the bait. She sent a message to Weston, a simple note delivered by a stable boy. "I know you're here. I survived. I want to make a deal." She requested a meeting. Alone. In his office that night. As dusk fell, she walked through the muddy streets of Silvercliff, not as a victim, but as a predator. She didn't hide her face. She didn't hide the scars. Let them look. Let him see what he had created. Weston's office was opulent, filled with mahogany and leather. He stood by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking out at the town he owned. He turned as she entered, and a slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. "Delia," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "A ghost. I have to admit I'm impressed. I always knew you were a survivor." "You have no idea what I am," she said, her voice cold as ice. He laughed. "Oh, I think I do. You're here for money, I assume. A quiet life somewhere far away. I can arrange that. For the ledger, of course. You admit it, then. You set the fire. You murdered my parents." His smile widened. "Your father was a self-righteous fool who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. It was business. Nothing personal." He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her, lingering on the scars at her neck. "A shame. What happened to your pretty face? But I did what was necessary." He confessed to everything. The fire, the murders, the lies. He bragged about his power, about how Blackwood had given him this town as a reward. He told her he should have made certain the job was finished himself. "It's a mistake I won't make twice," he snarled, his pleasant mask finally dropping. He lunged for her. But Delia was ready. She wasn't the frightened girl he remembered. She sidestepped, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth beside his desk. It was his, the tool for tending the fire in his comfortable office. The irony was exquisite. He paused, surprised by her defiance. "You think that can stop me?" "I'm not trying to stop you," Delia said, a grim smile on her lips. "I'm just trying to keep you busy." At that exact moment, a low, deep rumble started, vibrating through the floorboards. It grew louder, stronger, into a deafening roar that shook the entire building. The windows of Weston's office exploded inward as a massive, fiery explosion lit up the night sky from the direction of the main mine entrance. Weston stared in disbelief. "What? What was that?" "That," Delia said, "was my partner." Cole hadn't been waiting outside. While she was distracting Weston, he and Jebediah were at the mine, planting every last stick of dynamite Cole had. They hadn't just blown the entrance. They had collapsed the entire main shaft, burying Blackwood's private armory and trapping most of his paid thugs deep inside the mountain. Weston's face contorted with rage as he realized he'd been played. He charged her, but Delia was ready. She swung the heavy poker, a desperate, powerful arc of iron and righteous fury. Just as he fell, the doors to the office burst open. A dozen armed men stormed in, led by a grim-faced territorial marshal. Jebediah's rider had made it through. The law had finally come to Silvercliff. They took Weston away in chains. As Delia handed the ledger to the marshal, she saw a new commotion at the edge of town. A fancy carriage, drawn by 4 black horses, had just arrived, drawn by the sound of the explosion. A man stepped out, his face a mask of cold fury. Silas Blackwood. He had come to see his kingdom, only to find it in flames. And waiting for him, standing in the middle of the street, with a shotgun in his hands, was Cole. It wasn't a duel. Cole didn't even raise the gun. He just stood there as the marshals surrounded the stunned railroad baron. Justice, he had told her, wasn't a bullet in the dark. It was the truth, dragged out into the light for all to see. Months later, with Blackwood and Weston sentenced to hang, Cole and Delia stood on the land where her cabin had once been. The charred debris was gone, cleared away to reveal the rich earth beneath. "We could go anywhere," Cole said, taking her hand. "Start fresh." Delia looked at the mountains, at the creek, at the wide-open sky. "The fire took so much," she said softly. She touched the scars on her neck. She never wore high collars anymore. "But it didn't take the land, and it didn't take me." She turned to him, her eyes clear and bright. "These aren't an ending, Cole. They're a beginning." He pulled a small, simple silver ring from his pocket. "I spent years believing no one could love what was left of me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Then I found you, and I realized that what remains is what matters most." He slid the ring onto her finger. In the golden light of the setting sun, on the foundation of a life that had been destroyed, they decided to build a new one. Together. The scars of our past don't have to define our future. They can be a map that leads us to who we were always meant to become. If you were moved by Delia and Cole's story of survival and justice, hit that subscribe button for more stories that prove the human spirit is stronger than any fire.